Welcome to today's presentation. We're going to be talking about American innovation under threat, restrictive legislation, and global competition. I'm Mike Mandel, Chief Economist at the Progressive Policy Institute. At PPI, we believe that economic and social progress depends critically on policies to encourage science, research, and innovation. To encourage these important issues, PPI set up the Innovation Frontier Project. Over the past year, IFP has released policy studies in a wide variety of areas: the American workforce, the implications of space solar power, how to unlock frontier technology, how to encourage AI adoption by small and medium-sized businesses. Looking ahead, on December 3rd, IFP will be sponsoring a conference on better statistics for better policy, where leading academic experts discuss how the lack of good data in areas like supply chains and the digital economy is making policy much harder than it should be. To see more about IFP and sign up for our mailing list, go to innovationfrontier.org. That brings us to today's briefing. It's usual to think of innovation as only coming from small startups. But PPI has long been concerned with the important role that large-scale corporate research has historically played in creating and sustaining American economic leadership. Many of the companies that built America maintained strong corporate research labs, which developed new technologies and products across a wide range of areas. In other words, they had both scale and scope. Now the U.S. faces an unprecedented confluence of factors. Other countries are putting out a research effort whose scale and scope rivals ours. There's those words again. At the same time, the antitrust legislation being considered in Congress will have the unanticipated side effect of undermining U.S. research efforts in key fields such as quantum computing and artificial intelligence. That's why we asked Duke University professors Ashish Arora and Sharon Belenzon, two leading experts in the economics and strategy of innovation, to do a deep dive into the link between corporate research, U.S. technological competitiveness, and the current antitrust legislation. Today, Professor Arora will present the results of this deep dive, entitled American IT Innovation Under Threat, Restrictive Legislation, and Global Competition. Let me just say that I use the word deep dive very intentionally. The deck alone is 60 plus detailed charts and tables. Of course, we're not going to present them all today. There's also going to be a forthcoming paper, but we decided that given the importance of the subject, we present the deck first. I don't want to steal Professor Aurora's thunder, but let me just summarize the conclusions. First, American economic leadership in emerging technologies demonstrably depends on corporate research. Second, only a relatively few companies are investing in research at a meaningful level. Third, the antitrust proposals, if implemented as written, will impair the ability of those few leading R&D performers to develop new products and enter new markets. Fourth, the loss of tech companies with scale and scope will reduce U.S. investment in R&D and hurt American economic prosperity and security. This would be unfortunate for us all. Now let me introduce Professor Arora, who is the Rex D. Adams Professor of Business Administration at the Duke Fuqua School of Business. His co-author, Sharon Belenzon, is also a professor at the Fuqua School of Business. Together, they have written widely cited articles on the role of corporate research in the American innovation ecosystem. Ashish, why don't you take this over now?
Thank you, and good morning. So in this study, as Michael pointed out, we did a
You're muted.
U.S. science and technology leadership with particular attention to key technology segments that are identified as national priorities. Next slide, please. Michael, you'll have to hit the button so we can move the slide.
I can't hear him. Can you hear?
Michael, could you move the next slide, please? Hello?
1 second, please.
Yep. Michael, can you hear me?
Next slide.
Next slide, please. Thank you. So Michael summarized this. Let me just make the following observations. We're seeing a clear emerging challenge to the United States science and technology leadership, particularly in the tech sector. And in addition to the European and European firms in Japan, we can clearly see the emergence of Chinese firms as emerging challengers. The second point is, what's also clear is American industry remains strong where the leading companies invest in scientific research and basic and applied research. And I'll come back to this, but let me just make this vivid for you. Think about the part where America's science and technology leadership was unchallenged. You had companies like, you had labs like Xerox PARC, IBM, Bell Labs, DuPont Central Research, GE Central Research Labs, HP Labs. Many of those are now either gone or a pale shadow of their former selves. There are, however, some new tech companies that we all are familiar with that are engaging in research and have corporate labs of significant scale. And it is to those that we look towards in terms of the hope that they will continue to be key anchors of the US innovation ecosystem. And as Michael pointed out, the ability and willingness of firms to invest in such labs and to maintain these labs depends on their commercials, on the company's commercial scale and scope. And that's sort of the, if you like, the summary of the presentation. Next slide, please.
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to show you a bunch of data very soon, but we don't have time to go in detail about a lot of those data. Let me just say this. We used a variety of indicators to measure and to think about changes in US science and technology leadership. You're going to see inputs like R&D and STEM PhDs. You're going to see intermediate indicators like patents and scientific publications. And you're going to see outcome variables, for example, trade deficits in high-tech products or say VC funding. All of those, each indicator is imperfect in a variety of ways. Our hope is that when you look at all of these in totality, you will see a consistent picture being painted, namely that there are emerging challenges and that US science and technology leadership as a country depends critically on the investments that some of the leading companies make in scientific research. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So we studied in detail 6 segments, technology segments, which we mapped into the key technologies identified as national strategic priorities by this administration. And frankly, if you go back, previous administrations have identified similar segments as national strategic priorities. And these are quantum information science, artificial intelligence, advanced communication technologies, which we specifically looked at 5G, and to some extent you could think of cybersecurity as also being part of this. Robotics and autonomous systems, and we specifically look at autonomous vehicles. And finally, advanced computing infrastructure, and we look at semiconductors. And you can see that all of these paint a consistent picture. American leadership is at a different level in each of these. In some, there's a very clear sense that the rivals have gained considerable ground. But you can also see that that market leadership in each of these segments is closely tied to how the leading companies, the investments that these companies make in research, research and development, but particularly in research. Next slide, please. So this is quantum computing. This is at one level both very new and to some extent has been going on for a bit. The takeaway here, if you look at this slide, is these are scientific publications produced. I'll point out two things. First, look at the fact that there are private companies producing scientific research. In fact, if you look at the set of the bars on the right-hand side, which is the last 7 years, you will see that companies such as IBM, Microsoft, NTT, and Google, in fact, if you take the three American companies, they've produced more than twice as many scientific publications as MIT, which is, as we all know, one of the top universities in the world in science and technology. Next slide, please. And as I said, we use multiple indicators. So let me just point out that the companies that we saw as being leaders in research are also embodying some of that research in terms of the innovations that they've introduced in the market, in the marketplace. So we've seen IBM and Google, for example, or Alphabet, I guess, they're vying with each other in terms of quantum supremacy, and whether quantum computers can outperform conventional ones. But you can also see that these companies have also introduced innovations in the marketplace. And similarly, other companies like Amazon and Microsoft have also introduced products and services which allow other innovators in quantum to offer their services to users. Next slide, please. Turning to artificial intelligence. If you look at that pie chart, what that tells you is which are the top research organizations in the world as measured by the number of papers they presented at the top 10 AI conferences. So these are really the organizations that are advancing AI science, the science of artificial intelligence. There are 3 private companies included in this list of top 10. The rest are the world's best computer science departments: Carnegie Mellon, MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, Champaign-Urbana, Georgia Tech, and 3 private US companies. And if you expand the list, you'll get Facebook, Adobe, and AT&T, but no foreign firms in terms of papers published in top 10 AI conferences. Next slide, please. And once again, you can see this leadership reflected in marketplace innovations. We've all used digital assistants, voice activated, like Alexa or Siri. But there's a lot more where you can see these advances in artificial intelligence science being reflected in innovations and innovative products and services. For example, Alphabet's protein folding, Google Fold, which has the potential to revolutionize, for example, how new drugs are discovered. And once again, I'm not going to walk you through all of the particular examples, but we've all seen them now of how artificial intelligence is absolutely transforming not just the tech sector, but virtually a number of other sectors. So this really points to the issue of scope that Michael had mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. If you look at cybersecurity, you see a similar story, not as clear, but you still see, for example, in addition to the top computer science groups in the world, you also see private US companies that are advancing cybersecurity science. Okay. Next slide, please. All right, so if the 60 slide deck that Michael mentioned has a lot more detail on these six sectors, which are national priorities. Let me just summarize what are the key takeaways. First, there are multiple indicators that we can use to measure American leadership: patents, scientific publications, and depending on the particular segment, you can get market share data, for example, in 5G or in semiconductors, or you can get other kinds of metrics. For example, in 5G, you can look at the percentage of the 5G standard, the percentage of standard essential patents that companies are contributed to. And they, in general, they point in the same direction. First, that there is an emerging challenge. And in particular, you can see the rise of Chinese firms. Second, that American strength and leadership depends upon whether its leading companies invest in R&D, in particular in research, in the R of the R&D. And that companies that are scientific leaders also tend to be leaders in technology and typically also leaders in terms of marketplace innovations. Next slide, please. Now, I've kept emphasizing the importance of corporate investments in research and development, and there's a good reason for it. Over the last 50, 70 years, there has been a sustained decline in the share of R&D, US R&D, that the federal government has supported. This chart just shows the relative shares of the federal, and the blue part tells you the business funded R&D. And the bottom line here is back in the 50s, and well, even as late as the 70s, the federal government funded nearly 70% of US R&D expenditures. Today, that's down to a third of that. And business R&D is now 3 times federal R&D. And in fact, if you look at some of the leading tech companies, they invest something like 15% of their revenues into R&D, which is really, well, if you think about what that means, that's a very substantial investment. But it also points to how important that R&D is for American science and technology leadership. Next slide, please. This just summarizes the point that I've been driving through, and a lot of our research has established in different ways. Let me put the middle point. There's something special about corporate labs, because they can, in principle, do what universities and startups, which are really important, but universities and startups, if you just had an innovation ecosystem of just universities and startups, that would not be enough, because in many cases, for some technologies, the development of the science and its application happen best when they're integrated inside the company. And corporate labs have the scale, they have the resources, and they can bring together expertise that typically exists in very different and distinct university departments, that university labs can bring that together to create significant new advances. And the point is, there are now only a handful of firms that remain engaged in investing in such labs. Okay, and you've seen some of those in the charts that I have shown earlier. And this is in a way a story of a small number, a handful of companies that play a very important role in sustaining American leadership. Next slide, please. Now, now to the next part. What is it that motivates these companies to make such investments? Part of it is, the vision of the leaders and their strategy, but there is no doubt that these investments would not be sustainable if these companies did not have a large scale of operations to fund this research, and if they did not operate in a wide scope, in a diverse range of products and markets. And the reason is that if you think about scientific research, almost by definition, it's uncertain. The payoff periods are long, and it's not clear where exactly the first applications would be, right? So if you think about the same underlying technology that can predict how a particular protein will fold its three-dimensional structure, that the same technology would also be helpful in running the internal data structures of a cloud company. It's difficult to predict that beforehand. Once that happens, then you can see, of course, this is a broad general purpose, technology which can be used broadly, and which we therefore then leads a company to have broad scope. And so, just to underline the point, scale and scope are important to provide the incentives for company to invest in this research. And second, on the flip side, these are the consequences when company research is successful, particularly when you have made significant investments in basic and applied research. When those are successful, it's natural that the result would be an increase in the scope. The company would grow and would often grow in a range of products and markets. So scale and scope are both necessary in terms of providing incentives, but they're also the consequence of successful investments successful investments in research. Next slide, please. So we're now towards the end. Let me just read through or just emphasize what the conclusions are. There is growing growing challenge. There's growing a challenge to American science and technology leadership, particularly if we think about innovation. Second, as I mentioned earlier, a number of the leading companies that had these significant labs, Xerox PARC, HP Labs, GE, Kodak, DuPont, a number of those have gone away. And if you looked at the data, on average, there has been a decline, or there's been a retrenchment in terms of corporate investments in research. And this is really important, with some very significant exceptions. There are a handful of companies, and we can find them certainly in the tech sector, that have made sustained investments in research and that continue to invest in research on a meaningful scale, whose corporate labs are growing, they're not shrinking. And that American leadership in emerging technologies depends very importantly on these companies and the investments they're making. It follows, therefore, that policymakers should be very careful that their policies do not impair the incentives and the ability of these companies to continue to make such investments. And it's likely that significant restrictions on the ability of these companies to grow, to introduce new products, or to grow into new markets would impair their incentives and their ability to sustain these investments. And it's very clear that if these companies do reduce or scale back their engagement in R&D, and in particular in scientific research, this would definitely hurt American leadership, and I believe would also hurt American economic prosperity and security.
Well, thank you very much, Ashish.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if
I've,
I rushed through, but
I've got, no, that's good. That's terrific because I've got a couple of questions for you as well. And if people have, if people who are watching have questions, please put them into the Q&A box. Um, so, Ashish, you sort of mentioned the historical role of corporate research in the development of American economic leadership. Could you expand on that a bit? I mean, go back a little bit of the history here.
yeah, so I'm an amateur history buff, so we can go back right into the back to the 19, World War One, I guess, is a natural break point. And if you think about World War One, Michael, America was already the richest country on earth, but America was technically and scientifically behind Europe. And if you see, for example, the writings, even at the time of World War II, writers like Robert McLaurin, who was an economist at MIT, states very clearly, and you can see that in the Congressional record also, that America was still looking to Europe for scientific knowledge. Europe was still scientifically more advanced, but somewhere between World War One and World War II, American corporations started to make significant investments in R&D, and the first four were GE, AT&T, Bell Labs, DuPont, and Kodak. And their investments proved to be both scientific, they had tremendous scientific success, but also great commercial success. And then a whole bunch of other companies followed. And this sort of became not quite the norm, but a number of companies followed the strategy of making these investments. And if you look at sort of the golden age, which is roughly 1940 through 1980, you can see this, in companies like General Motors, Hughes. This has been, and if you can think about, just to put this further, think about the products that came out. The transistor came out from corporate research. Nylon, polyester came out from DuPont. Synthetic rubber, tremendous new advances in petrochemical refining from Phillips and from Standard Oil. And one after the other, we can think of incredible products that came out of these labs. In some cases, if you think about Xerox, PARC, Palo Alto Research Center, the GUI, the graphical user interface, the mouse, local area networking, these all came out of Xerox PARC, were not commercialized by Xerox. And that sort of points to some of the issues that companies had in terms of making their investments, that they were not able to always capture the benefits that their corporate labs were creating. And there's plenty of other examples. And Sharon and I have a recent paper in the American Economic Review, which does this more systematically using econometrics. But the bottom line is somewhere around the mid-1980s, the trend reversed. Companies began to withdraw. Shareholders began to ask, what are we getting for our investments? And so the broad trend has been one of retrenchment. But as I said, there are a few bright sparks, which
before you go on, just I mean, why do you think that a lot of corporations withdrew from doing research? Because I think that's just so interesting. That transition is part of the problem with the American economy at this point, that we had it was this change that nobody really expected.
Well, so that's a great question, Michael. I don't have all the answers. I have some speculations. Some of those things we have investigated. There are a number of things that are going on, right? You have the rise of foreign competition, and then you have you have decline of market share as you get more foreign competition. You also have the rise of universities. I mean, universities, as I mentioned earlier, in 1940, American universities were not really very significant sources of scientific knowledge. And that's changed tremendously since the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and so on. So we've got a massive increase in the university sector. And since the 1980s, we've also had, with the Bayh-Dole Act and the rise of venture capital, we have a very vibrant startup sector. So the American innovation ecosystem in some ways has become more diverse. There are many more actors in this, but I think for specific types of sort of broad technologies, and in particular sectors, the role of corporate labs, I think, remains as before. And you're right, some of the problems can be traced to the decline of these labs. I should also point out there's a spirited debate about whether the sort of the changes in the financial markets, and particularly the equity markets, and the greater pressure for shareholder return has anything to do with it. My co-author and I are on different sides of that debate. So I won't put words in his mouth, and I won't just present a one-sided view on that.
That's so. Please, if you have questions, put it into the Q&A box. So talk a little bit about the scale and scope of America, some of the foreign competitors at this point. I mean, companies like Samsung and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, there's a chart which in the deck which points it out. First, at a high level, I was really surprised to see, if you just compare, without any sort of adjustments for exchange rate, purchasing power parity or any of that sort of stuff, if you just do nominal comparisons, how large some of the competitors are. So Samsung is probably bigger than any of the American firms, with the possible exception of Amazon. I believe that's the case. I'd have to look. And second, what's really impressive is the growth rate of some of these companies, how rapidly they're growing, and how quickly they've been able to advance. I see a question in the Q&A.
Let's see. Why do we have so few large companies engaged in frontier innovation? Should policy aim at enabling others to achieve the requisite size and scope, and to sort of add to it, should policy, be addressed to reducing size and scope?
So this is an interesting question. I think it really matters how the size and scope was attained. I'll take you back to the 1920s. DuPont is a sort of by that time already an established company. It's producing smokeless explosives, and they embark on a program of research in this newfangled field of polymers. And very quickly they come up with neoprene, which is a type of artificial rubber, and then they develop nylon. And nylon was a home run, as you could well imagine. Now, it took 10 plus years, maybe even longer, for the size and the importance of that discovery to be seen. But there's no question that DuPont's growth from, say, 1920 well into the 1960s was based on these fundamental inventions that came out of their corporate labs. And mind you, DuPont was forced to allow other companies, a company called, never mind. There was a company called Chemstrand, which then would also had a license to produce. They were required to give a license to produce nylon. This is all a way of saying the size and scope of companies. If I think about the present tech companies, to a considerable extent reflects the success of the investments they made in research, and their ability to develop that research into commercially useful products. So it would be a mistake, therefore, I would say, to then after the fact say, no, we should not allow you the benefits of this success. And I think that would really hurt the incentives of companies to make such investments.
So generally speaking, you're talking about an innovation in an ecosystem that has three legs to it. One is universities, one is startups, and one is a corporate research. And what we're talking about is keeping some degree of balance here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So take the simplest version of this, Michael, which is um, if you think of most startups, uh, their exit plans, their plans for how they're going to return the money to their investors involves an acquisition by one of the large startups, by the large incumbents. This is true in biotech. This is true in the tech sector. And this is probably true even in other parts of the economy. So at a minimum, you need these anchor tenants, if you like, the incumbents to provide that sort of exit. But I think over and above that, there are significant inventions that are just beyond the ability of the university plus startup sector. So ask yourself, for example, what's happening to the quest for the next generation of semiconducting materials? Right? We've been hearing about the end of silicon. And there's no question in my mind that the only way we will get a new next generation semiconducting material we would have gotten is if IBM and Intel had made those investments and those investments had been successful. Now, I don't know what the precise details were, but there's no doubt that the decline of IBM, you know, as a corporation in the 90s and beyond, significantly hurt the quest for the next generation of semiconducting materials. The point being, for certain types of innovations and certain types of technologies, you can only really get them when you have a corporate lab that can bring together different disciplines, different types of expertise. The transistor was a classic example. It brought together, expertise in chemistry, in physics, in engineering, in metallurgy, in materials. And without that, we would not have got the integrated circuit transistor. Does that make sense?
So if it makes perfect sense. So your research suggests that that if the antitrust legislation is implemented as written right now, it could actually could undermine the ability of these companies to have the scale and scope that they need to conduct this kind of R&D.
Absolutely. I think there's no question that that restricting the ability of firms to grow into new markets or to integrate products will impair their incentives to invest in these broad-ranging research programs. We might then get very specific point solutions, small, they're not necessarily small inventions, but there's a point, they're limited in terms of their impact. But there's, for example, this broad-based investment in artificial intelligence, I think requires that companies have long horizons and the ability to deploy the scientific advances they're getting into a range of products. And that restricting that will undoubtedly hurt their incentives to, or will reduce their incentives to make those investments.
So this, this really combines two different strands here, all right, that requires us to think about what the U.S. innovation ecosystem looks like, what generates U.S. technological leadership, and then what sort of policies we want to have. Is there anything you'd like to sort of summarize with at this point?
Yeah, so, as you pointed out, there are three legs to the innovation ecosystems too. There's the universities, there are startups, and there is the incumbent firms that we've talked about. A lot of our policy has been oriented towards universities and to startups and to thinking about what creates the incentives for them. I think it's very important for policymakers to keep in mind this third leg of the stool, and to ensure that we have a vibrant set of leading firms. And these leading firms have to be vibrant, not just in terms of their ability to deploy the inventions that come out of the startups and to acquire the startups and to scale them up, but also, and I would say in some ways even more, the ability to keep generating internal scientific research and to take that research and to convert it into commercially viable applications. That it's really important for policymakers not to lose sight of that critical role that these handful of firms play.
Well, terrific. I think that we'll give people an opportunity. Oh, there's one more question. Okay. Um, China is cracking down on private companies, okay, including tech firms. What are the implications for U.S. tech companies?
Um, so it's difficult to, so let's think about it. It's likely that this will hurt the incentives of Chinese companies to make the sorts of investments that the American companies have been making. I would say that this presents an interesting opportunity for U.S. tech companies. And if these companies are not hampered by policy, and they're not unduly restricted by regulation, that this would be an opportunity for these companies to make those investments and to then convert them into useful and commercially viable products and services. So this is an interesting opportunity to grow for the.
So we've reached a natural stopping point here. Okay, if let's just wait a minute to see if there's any more questions. Well, thanks very much. Remember that you can get the full slide deck will be available, and that this is coming out of the Innovation Frontier project of PPI, and it was done by Professor Aurora and Professor Balanzone. I'm sorry, I keep mispronouncing his name, and I really shouldn't do that. Okay, give me his pronunciation, and I'll get it right.
Sharon Balanzone.
Sharon Balanzone. Okay, I apologize to you, Sharon. That's really my problem. And it's absolutely great work, and we thank you all very much for attending today. Thank you.